Welcome to our screencast on state statutes. So to review where we left off with federal statutes, we had talked about session laws, which are essentially the laws enacted by the legislature, signed by the executive, and they are organized chronologically. And in the federal world, we learned that the session laws are actually called public laws, and those public laws live in statutes at large and in USCAN. So today we move over to the right-hand column where we're going to talk about New York and states generally. So here in New York, our session law, again the generic name for a law passed by the legislature, now the state legislature, which in New York is the Assembly and the Senate, and signed by the governor. In New York, instead of calling them public laws, for whatever reason, we call them chapter laws. And you will find those chapter laws, again, New York's name for session laws, in the set called McKinney's session laws. We also talked about the magic and the use of the force that is codification. So we take all of those session laws and we put them in a subject compilation of legislation, and only those session laws that are currently in force, and we put them into the code. Now, as we saw last time, in the federal world, that code is called the United States Code, and you will find the United States Code also in the United States Code Annotated and the United States Code Service. By that, I mean the official publication is the United States Code, the unofficial publications, the annotated codes, which are our very best friends, are the USCA and the USCS. Again, moving to New York, we will find the force used, the magic of codification in, again, it's called McKinney's, but you will find the McKinney's code in the black volumes of McKinney's. The session laws actually are in red volumes. And another unofficial code is called CLS, or Consolidated Laws Service. So you will find the McKinney's code on Westlaw, and you will find CLS on Lexis, as well as both are in print. So again, you will find the codified laws of New York that are currently in force, that are arranged by subject in McKinney's, the black volumes in print. Or on Westlaw, CLS, Consolidated Law Service, again in print, or on Lexis. So if we now want to turn to where we find the New York law as it affects our client regarding her wish to hold her HMO liable, we want to look specifically in New York. So as we have discussed, if you don't know much about the law in your particular jurisdiction, a great place to start is an encyclopedia. And here in New York, we have a great encyclopedia called New York Jur. Now, I have suggested in the past that a good strategy for using secondary sources when you don't know much about the area is to not narrow by jurisdiction. I am going to narrow by jurisdiction because our question now is jurisdiction specific. What is the law in New York as it applies to our client? So I am here on Westlaw, and I am going to ask Westlaw specifically to go to New York jurisprudence. And Westlaw, if you just type in the name of a resource, it will find that resource. A lot of the times it will find that resource for you. So here we are in New York Jur. And again, we're starting in secondary sources to look for statutes because we don't know much about the area, and that's the best place to go. And we're starting specifically in New York Jur because we've done our general research for our client and learned our way around the HMO liability problem. We know about the preemption, we know about other aspects of it. We now want to see how it specifically applies in New York. So that's why we're starting in secondary source. Great place to start your research, but specifically for New York. So let's enter our search terms. And again, I'm being pretty general here. And sure enough, after a little bit of time, Westlaw pulls up its results. And you may or may not remember, in our first class, the group that looked at New York jurisprudence actually found this section 115 on health maintenance organization. And we see that that is part of the overall topic of malpractice. So we know we're on the right track. We might want to scroll down further to see what else is interesting. But we know this one is, so let's take a look. And again, as always, we want to take a look at the table of contents to see if there are other sections that are interesting. But focusing on our section, we read through and we get the introduction that each member employee of the organization may be fully and personally liable. So here, New Yorker is suggesting a possible way to get our client recovery if we can see if the person or agent in the organization has been negligent or has done any wrongful act or misconduct under her direct supervision and control while rendering professional services on behalf of the organization. So we've seen that term professional services. We now understand that at least here in New York, that is a relevant term for our situation. And of course, we want to check those wonderful footnotes. And sure enough, New York Jur gives us reference to a New York statute, Pub Health Law 4410. So let's click on the reference and talk about New York statutes. So again, what we've done this far is we have investigated a New York specific secondary source to get us reference to the New York Code. And we are looking in McKinney's Consolidated Laws. As I mentioned, McKinney's is on Westlaw, and we are looking at our specific section. Let's take a look at the heading. This heading information you typically just ignore, but it is really, really useful. So in addition to confirming where we are, what it tells us is that we're in the public health law. New York organizes its code by name of topic. Remember, we said title is another term for subject area. So New York just arranges its code by subject areas. So subject areas names rather than numbers. In the USC, they give the subject or titles numbers. Remember, we were looking at subject area labor, title number 29. Here in New York, it's just the name public health law. And then the public health law has different areas or chapters, and within those chapters, articles, and we see we're in the article all about health maintenance organizations. So what this heading information is telling me is I am in the right context. This is sometimes referred to by librarians as the statutory scheme. That's not my favorite term, honestly. I like to think of it as the subject area or statutory context. So we're in the context of health maintenance organizations, so we know we are in the right place. Just to reinforce this idea of statutory scheme or statutory context, as I like to call it, let's go back and look at our section in the USCA, in the Federal Code, Title 29 USCA 1144. And we see 1144 down here. If we were interested in a different concept, a different issue entirely, forget about our client for the moment, if our interest had to do with securities law, and actually in securities law there is also this concept of preemption. Preemption, the idea that federal law preempts state law, can appear in very different areas within the law. So securities law is one of them, and if we did a search for securities and preemption, we would actually pull up section 1144, because somewhere in the text here the word securities applies, probably in one of the notes of decision, and of course the word preemption applies in quite a number of the notes of decision. But if we saw, oh look, securities, preemption, let me look at 1144, if we did not notice what context we were in, we wouldn't realize that we're in the labor context. That has nothing to do with securities. So anytime we look at a statutory code after we've done a keyword search, we must check this context. We must check the statutory scheme, as I said, some librarians like to call it, to make sure we are in the right subject area, that we are in the right context. So for securities, if we had done that preemption security search, this would not be the right context. However, for our search, preemption and ERISA, this of course is the right context. Okay, let's go back to our New York code. We have determined we are absolutely in the right context, health maintenance organizations within the public law code. So looking here at the New York annotated code, what we will see is pretty much just what we saw when we looked at the USCA, the federal annotated code. The names have been slightly changed, so as I said, we call our titles by name in New York instead of by number like we do in the federal, but otherwise the annotated code features are pretty much the same, and they even look the same on Westlaw. So we see notes of decisions, we see citing references, and we see context and analysis. The context and analysis is exactly the same. It will give us secondary sources that help explain our particular code section. And very likely, since we are in a New York code, it will give us some references to New York specific materials like New York Jur under encyclopedias and possibly some New York treatises. We also see the notes of decisions. The notes of decisions, remember, give us the citations, the cases that interpret our particular code section. And what the notes of decisions does specifically is it gives us topic names. So in this case, we don't have a whole lot of notes of decisions. There are only 10, but it organizes those 10 decisions by these various topics. So that can be really, really useful when you have a whole lot more decisions with a whole lot of topics. Again, if we take a look at 1144 in the Federal Code in the USCA, notes that there are nearly 2,000 notes of decisions, and remember when we looked at this, we saw a whole long list of topics, and it was really useful to be able to narrow our topic to HMOs, to negligence, to the various topics of interest to us for our client. So back here in New York, notes of decisions are still very useful. Again, it will give us cases that interpret our section, so it's doing our research for us. So still our very best friend for code research. Very similarly, and several people get this confused, is the citing references, because citing references do kind of the same thing. Citing references give us cases that cite to our code section. So the cases may be less particular in discussing our particular code section. It may just cite it very generally. The notes of decisions will give us more cases that really discuss our section in depth. But the citing references also give us other resources like context and analysis, and it will give us secondary sources that again cite to our code section, not necessarily discuss it, as well as some of these other types of documents. And if we take a look at the cases in citing references, citing references does a couple of other things for us. Citing references will allow us to filter here. If we scroll down a little, you will see our filter by jurisdiction. So unlike the notes of decisions, we can filter by specific jurisdictions. This is going to be particularly useful back in our federal code section because we could narrow to our particular circuit. And what citing references also does is it allows us to narrow to specific notes of decisions topics. So citing references actually does allow us to organize these citing cases by topic if we want. So you can see some references here. So this particular case was also in the notes of decision under this particular topic. And again, as I said, we also have the advantage here of narrowing by particular jurisdiction. So in New York State, we could narrow by a particular department. And when we talk about cases, we will talk about why that is important. So here, looking back at the section 4410 of our public health law in McKinney, so our New York Code, let's review some other aspects of state statute and code sections. So this code section 4410, again, at the bottom, just like we did with our federal code, we can scroll down and we see the credits. And again, the credits on Westlaw is the same as history on Lexis, which tells us what session laws, so again, remember here in New York we call session laws chapter laws, so what chapter laws enacted our section. So as we read through, we see that our section 4410 was originally added in 1976 by C, or chapter 938, and section 1 within 938. We see that that was amended in 1993 by chapter 538 and section 6 within 538, chapter 538. And we see that wonderful punctuation, semicolon, so we think to ourselves, and amended by, in 1996, chapter 705, section 5 of chapter 705, and that became effective in October of 1996. So again, that's how we read our credits, and it works just the same in New York as it does in the federal code, the only difference being, again, the name chapter law for New York instead of public law for federal. So we want to distinguish when our section was updated versus when all of Westlaw New York Code was updated. So when our section was updated, we just saw that in the credits. When all of New York Code is updated, we see that here on Westlaw with the currentness link. And so just below the credits where the section 4410 is updated, we see Westlaw telling us when McKinney's was updated, and McKinney's was updated through the laws of 2019, chapters 1 through 10. So again, try to keep straight in your mind when the section was updated, that's going to be in the credit, versus when Westlaw updated the code, and that's going to be the currentness link down here at the bottom. So we found section 4410 reading through New York Jur. We always want to make sure not only to check our statutory context, but once we do determine that we have a useful section, we want to check that wonderfully useful table of contents. Now we can do that a couple of ways. Here on Westlaw, we can click here, or we can just click on the heading info. Again, this heading is really useful for a whole bunch of different reasons. And that brings us to the table of contents for Article 44 about health maintenance organizations. And as we scroll through, we see, oh, look, there are definitions. We better check that out to see if any terms are defined that might be important to us. And as we scroll down, we see, of course, 4410 where we started for, but we might also notice section 4406, health maintenance organization regulation of contracts, might also be of interest. Another great thing about this table of contents, here on the side, Westlaw will give us links to other useful aspects of the code. One in particular is the index. So we found our section 4410 looking through New York Jur, secondary source, but we want to also check for statutes a second way, because New Yorker may only tell us about one aspect of our issue, again, depending on our search terms, depending on what New Yorker tells us. So we want to make sure that there's not another aspect of our issue that's covered in a different part of the New York Code. And we can do that a couple of different ways. We can do that just by doing a keyword search in our code. We can also look at the index here. And I'm actually not a fan of using indexes online. I personally go to the books, but it's here and it's easy to get to. So taking a look at the index, we could actually do a keyword search, or we can browse. So if we go to H for health maintenance and then browse down, we might want to check under HMO first as well. So when using indexes, you want to check basically all terms that could be relevant. So whether it's an abbreviation like HMO, which I don't think we'll find here, and it turns out I'm right, no HMO, or since we know what that stands for, going up to health maintenance as I suggested. So going back up to health maintenance, health systems, we're almost there. And hopefully it is there, and sure enough, we're lucky there's health maintenance organizations. And now another tip for using indexes, whether online or in print, is in addition to checking abbreviations as well as the full phrase, you want to check your terms in different orders. So we may want to check under D for denial of care. We might want to check under C for care. Don't see anything under care. We might want to go down to denial. We might want to think about other ways of expressing our idea, like denial of coverage. And sure enough, there is a link here for coverage, which we would want to check out. And is looking down, nothing under denial, so it looks like coverage might be our best bet in using the index. And as I said, one other alternative, if we didn't want to look at the index, is just to, again, making sure we found all of the relevant areas for our issue, is just doing a keyword search. So we might want to go specifically to our state. And there are any number of ways of getting to the New York statutes and doing a specific search within New York statutes. Or we could just do our search and then filter after we do our search. So if we try HMO liability and see what we get there. Okay, so that is New York statutes on Westlaw. So again, we could see in these results on Westlaw whether we find anything of use. And sure enough, there's our section 4406. And finding 4406, we could investigate the table of contents and find 4410. So as I said, that is our New York Code on Westlaw. Let's take a look at Lexis. So let's go to the home page here of Lexis. And again, we can do a keyword search. We can look in New Yorker. New Yorker would work the same way. Let's try our general search here for liability HMO. And again, I can do my search first and then filter, or filter first to New York and New York statutes and then do my search. So since I did my search first, I will now filter. And one thing you want to keep in mind in filtering for statutes on Lexis is I've filtered to statutes and legislation, but if I want my best friend, my annotated code, I need to tell Lexis I want codes, and not this other type of legislative material. We'll be talking about this when we talk about legislative history. When we're doing statutory research, when we want to find the law as it exists today in our statutory code, we need to tell Lexis go to codes. And of course, we want to go specifically to our state. Again, with regard to statutes from other states are really not persuasive, so it's not that interesting or really at all interesting to look at other states' statutes to determine what the law is in our state. Okay, so at long last we've made it here to New York, the New York Code, and again on Lexis uses the other annotated code, the New York Consolidated Law Service, or CLS. And scrolling down, we're not finding anything in our area, again in our statutory context or statutory scheme. I'm seeing a lot of limited liability company that's not relevant to us. So one thing you need to be particularly careful about when searching, doing keyword searching in statutory codes are your words. Statutes are put together by legislatures, and they examine sometimes every single word. So the terminology can be very specialized. So as we've seen, in the federal world, we saw supersedure and we saw other laws. The word preemption actually wasn't even mentioned in the text of our Federal Statutory Code section 1144. It was mentioned in the notes of decisions. So sometimes you need to use these terms and connectors to be more specific. There we go. To be more specific about your terminology and their relationship, and the terms and their relationship with one another. So once again, here in Lexis, I have searched everything, so I need to filter after my search. So I will filter to statutes and legislation, and again to codes. And finally, expanding my jurisdiction so that I can find New York. And what we will see eventually in New York, again, so a little bit better, we're getting a reference to a statutory context or a statutory scheme that is relevant to us, public health law. So I might, if I didn't already know other sections, I might take a look at this and again look around at the table of contents. But scrolling down, it turns out that Lexis does, in fact, find our relevant section. So investigating our annotated code features on Lexis, again, the features are pretty much the same. They're just organized a little bit differently. We see the table of contents we can expand here, or again, looking at that very important statutory context, we see we can click on the links here, and that would bring us to the table of contents. Going back to our section, the other annotated code features, again, our BFF for statutory research. We need to use the go-to menu, and we see notes of decisions. So again, the cases that talk about our section 4410. We also see research references, so again, secondary sources that help to interpret our section. And last but not least, with regard to annotated codes, let's take a look at Bloomberg Law. So we will now look here on Bloomberg to see how Bloomberg deals with state annotated codes. We could do a general search on Bloomberg and first investigate secondary sources if we hadn't already done other research. What I am going to do now, just to focus specifically on state statutes, is to tell Bloomberg to go to the New York Code specifically. So I'm going to select U.S. jurisdiction and state law, and I will scroll down to New York, of course, and then I will tell Bloomberg specifically, rather choose New York legislative, and then tell Bloomberg specifically I want New York consolidated laws. That is the annotated code for Bloomberg. And then I will enter my keywords here. Again, I'm going to do my more detailed search telling Bloomberg how to treat the different terms with my terms and connectors /P and so forth. Again, because I'm searching the controlled vocabulary of a code, I'm going to be more specific. And taking a look at our results, Bloomberg shows us some sections of the insurance law which may actually be relevant, so we would want to check those out to see if they are. But Bloomberg also finds our section 4410, so I am going to show you that by way of comparison. Bloomberg's annotated code is not as robust as Lexis or Westlaw, so we will not find references to secondary sources so much, but we do have the ever-useful table of contents. And I should mention on Bloomberg that you should be very careful not to make the same mistake I did and get fooled by this table of contents. This table of contents is just going to show you the table of contents for 4410. I personally don't find that particularly useful. The useful table of contents, again, is this ever useful heading information. And again, if I click on the heading of interest, that brings me to the different sections, to the table of contents for Bloomberg, again, where I can investigate other potential relevant sections. The other aspect of Bloomberg's annotated code, as we saw with the USC, is the SMART code. And again, what Bloomberg will do for us is tell us what cases interpret section 4410. And the cases that Bloomberg find are going to be different than Lexis and different than Westlaw. They're all different. What Bloomberg does show us in the SMART code, though, which is rather useful, is Bloomberg allows us to limit by court, by jurisdiction, as well as by topic. So that can be very useful, as we saw with citing references on Westlaw. Going back to the text of 4410, the other aspect of Bloomberg's code is we will see the general info. So we will see how up-to-date the code on Bloomberg is. So we see the current through here. So what Bloomberg does not do, however, is Bloomberg does not tell us if there are any cases that might have determined that all of section 4410 or any part of section 4410, any subsection, has been found unconstitutional by a court. And this is the last portion of talking about state annotated codes that we need to talk about, and that is citators. So we have updated, and updated with regard to determining how up-to-date our code section is on Bloomberg by looking at the current through. As I mentioned, there is no place other than looking at the SMART code and looking at the case analysis for each of those cases to determine whether those cases ruled our section to be invalid or unconstitutional. But let's take a look at how that works on Lexis and Westlaw, because they do provide us with citators. And on Lexis, the citator is, of course, Shepard's. But let's also review on Lexis, because I didn't do so earlier, how to make sure we are updated in terms of how up-to-date Lexis is. So Lexis makes it very easy for us. Again, right up here at top, it tells us that the Lexis code is current through 2019 through chapters 1 through 10 in the state of New York. Again, remember the difference between how up-to-date the entire Lexis code is versus when our section was last amended, and that's in the history. And again, to review our section, so section 4410 only was initially enacted in 1976 by chapter 938. There's our ever useful semicolon, so and amended by in 1993, chapter 538, and once again amended in 1996 by chapter 705. So again, the difference between when section 4410 was last amended or changed and when Lexis last updated our entire code in 2019 through chapter 10 in New York. Okay, so that's how up-to-date the text is in our Lexis code, and we now know when 4410 was last amended, but what about that question about whether or not cases have determined that our section or any subsections within our section may be unconstitutional or invalid? And again, we look to Shepard's for that. And Shepard's gives us this plus signal, which unfortunately it is not giving us a highlight to tell us what that means. There is a way around it, and that is using this signals on subsections, and I'll explain what that means in just a moment. But what that signals on subsection does is it shows us the signals for the particular subsections. So I see that subsection 1, the signal turns out, that plus signal turns out to mean positive treatment is indicated. Subsection 2, that signal is telling us that they're just citing references with analysis that are available. So if we Shepardize our document, that is where we will see the Shepard's report with the cases and how those cases analyzed our particular code section. So we see positive and neutral. We don't see any negative. We don't see any ruled unconstitutional. So we know we're fine. And this is another way, again, of finding cases that cite to our code section 4410. Think of the Shepard's report as similar to citing references on Westlaw. What Lexis also does, which is kind of neat that neither Bloomberg or Westlaw does, is it gives us a specific report by subsection. Now we saw that when we clicked on that little tab to show subsection analysis, but we can see the detailed subsection report here. And so here we see subsection 1 has a particular citation. So if we wanted to focus just on cases that talk about subsection 1 of 4410, we could see a total of 8 citations, some of which should be cases. Okay, so let's go back to 4410. And the other aspect on Lexis I will show you having to do with finding code sections is if you already have a citation to a code section. So say you already know about 4410 and you just want to pull it up on Lexis. With state code sections, it can be really tricky knowing the exact syntax, the exact letters and words to type in for Lexis to recognize that as a state code section. So in other words, do I type in NY Public Health? Do I type in New York Public Health? Do I type in NY Pub Health? I don't know how Lexis abbreviates that. To figure that out, I would go to Get a Doc Assistance. And then you would just follow, you can select contact type, I would select statutory codes, and then I would select my jurisdiction, and then Lexis would give you a nice template. So I would scroll down to public health and I would be able to type in my section number. Okay, let's go to Westlaw. And first, let's take a look and see, now that we're talking about getting a document by citation or getting a state code document by citation, Westlaw also provides us a very nice template, and the way to find it is to type in your state code abbreviation, so NY, and the word code. And Westlaw will prompt us to go to New York Statute and Court Rules. And what Westlaw provides for us, again, on the side here are these useful links. We actually already looked at this when we looked at the statutes index. We can also get the find template. And here we see a nice template again. So I can get to our section and by scrolling down to public health, and I'm going to take a look at section 4410 to get back there so we can talk about citators on Westlaw. And actually, truth be told, we've already talked about citators on Westlaw because we've talked about citing references. So citing references, again, will give us those cases that cite to section 4410. And again, by going to citing references, those cases, that will allow us to narrow by jurisdiction, narrow by notes of decision topic, as we have already discussed here in the filter. So again, here's jurisdiction, here's notes of decision topic. But how do I know whether these cases have either determined that one of our subsections or the entire section is unconstitutional or somehow invalid? Yes, I could read through them, but Westlaw actually gives us a signal for that. And it does that using flags when you're looking at the main section. So looking at the section here, I don't see any flags. So what that's telling me is that no case has ruled any part of this invalid. To see an example of a flag, I'm going to go to our table of contents again, and here's where you see those flags, and that's what those flags are telling us. So for example, if I scroll down to 4406, which we've looked at before, I notice a flag. And what this flag is telling me is not so much that there are any cases, but just that there's proposed legislation. So when you see a flag on a code section in Westlaw, don't think, oh my goodness, this is no longer valid. You need to read the text. And all that's telling me is that the New York State Legislature has proposed legislation that might change our section. So they may or may not pass that legislation. In fact, most of the time, proposed legislation doesn't get passed. But that's just giving me a heads up that there may be changes there may be, very only possibly, be changes in the future. But again, what about cases that may determine that our code section is unconstitutional or somehow held invalid? So I will show you an example of how Westlaw gives us that information by going back to section 1144. And what the flags, and notice we see a flag, and what the flags tell us, again, notice there's some proposed legislation to change 1144. Now again, this is in the Congress and on the federal level. We don't know if that legislation is going to pass, but that is something that Westlaw is giving us an alert or information on, so we should be aware that that's possible. But this other flag tells us about how cases have treated our section 1144, and it's telling us unconstitutional preempted, and again, don't jump to conclusions that, oh my goodness, 1144 is invalid. What Westlaw's telling us, prior versions limitation recognized by this particular case. So there was a prior version of 1144 that this case recognized as being limited in its scope or application. So a lot of times these flags on Westlaw will tell you about a case, but it'll tell you about a case that looked at a particular section or subsection and only applied in a very limited means. So when you see a flag and you see a case, you need to check it out, but don't just automatically assume that your section is no longer valid because you see a flag. In fact, that's very rarely the case. What you really want to be aware of is when you see a red flag, but again, you need to check out that case to see what it says about your section and if it has anything to do with your issue. So one last feature about the annotated code on Westlaw that I will show you, and that's how to find the popular name table. So there are acts in New York law that you may want to find by name. A lot of times laws are named for particular individuals that inspired the law, like Megan's Law. So if you wanted to find those laws, you can, of course, Google it, and that sometimes will pull it up, but I find for state laws, Google is a lot less reliable, so it's good to know about the popular name table, and you can get to that a couple of ways here on Westlaw. Again, the ever useful heading information. If you click on the link in that to get to the table of contents, you'll see the popular name table here, or the other, frankly, easier way is you can go to New York Statutes Popular Name Table, and there you see it there. Here on Lexis, as far as I can tell, there is no popular name table, but if you type in New York Statutes, you will see how to get to the index for the New York Consolidated Law Service. And that is all on